Hello. There we go. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Weight Neutral Nutrition podcast. My name is Devin Dirksen. I am your host, and I'm joined by Julia Parzyk today. And we are super excited to chat with you about all things healing, relationship with food, everything like that. Julia is, I would say, like a fairly public figure, and she's very open about her journey. So, super excited to have her on the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here and chat with you about all things food and healing.
Yeah, awesome. So I guess we'll just kind of start with like the basics. Like tell us about your journey, where you kind of came from, where you are now, and then how you help people in what you do now.
Yeah. I kind of got into this eating disorder recovery kind of body image space. Took me a long time to get here. I'm 33 now, and I struggled with an eating disorder for about 10 years, from like 14 to 24. Um, Growing up in the early 2000s was just like the epitome of, all things toxic and diet culture, and grew up in a family that, while super, super loving, was, susceptible to all of the things from media manipulation, all those things, and just not feeling good in my body and not feeling like I was ever skinny enough, pretty enough. And I ended up developing an eating disorder pretty early on, and just very much immersed myself in all things diet culture. I tried every diet in the book. I did diet pills, laxatives, diuretics, all the things, all the damaging things to my body at a very young age. And um at that time I was at the time that it was pretty bad, I was in school to be a teacher, and I have always loved working with kids, worked with kids in nannying as an educator and stuff like that. And I kind of hit this point in my life. I was 24. I had just quit my teaching job in Michigan at the time. I moved out to Los Angeles and was a nanny out there. And I just remembered seeing so many things within my students and nanny, like around nanny kids and stuff like that, like them talking poorly about their bodies. And I had like one second grade student say something along the lines of, we were talking about like goals for the year or something like that, and she's like, my goal is to have like a six pack. And I was like, you're seven.
Oh my God.
And it was just this like wake up call where I was like, oh my gosh, this starts so young, and I'm someone that, like, I really want to be a mother. And I know that shit gets passed down to you. It's something that is, you learn it from seeing other behaviors. Our media is absolutely terrible, and I just remember thinking, like, I don't want to hate my body anymore, and I'm so sick of like counting almonds as snacks and just like
Mhm.
constantly being just, my whole brain was consumed with just what I was eating, how I looked, how many calories I was burning. And I was just like, I don't have the capacity for anything else. Like, I was just like, I don't have the capacity to deal with anything else. And I decided to seek out my own type of recovery. I never went to a treatment center, but I did my own kind of like treatment through outpatient. I worked with a therapist and registered dietitian for a couple of years while I lived out in Los Angeles, and luckily recovered from my eating disorder. And I've always loved the mental health space. And I was like, wow, I really, really love this space. I really love body image work. And I ended up becoming an eating disorder recovery coach for a while, and really immersing myself in that space, and just kind of taking my pain and turning it into my passion. And did the coaching for a little bit, and I also do like brand partnerships online. I'm in the influencing space, kind of all centered around like body acceptance and women empowerment. And yeah, now I host support groups, and I work for Eating Recovery Center, which is one of the biggest treatment centers, um, creating content for them. And yeah, everything's just come really full circle. It took me, I think I'm like 8 or 9 years into my recovery now. Yeah, it took me a while to get here,
Yeah, for
but I
sure. Well,
arrived.
thank you so much for sharing because, yeah, that's your journey in a nutshell in like what,
Yeah.
2, 3 minutes there. So, yeah, no, that's perfect. And I think people listening can for sure like relate, I'm sure, to your story. I know like for me personally, I never like was into like diet pills or anything of that nature, but for sure it was like counting the almonds and like
Ugh.
constant like obsession around food. And I think it's so interesting because we talk about healing and we talk about recovery, and I would just love to hear your thoughts about like how those like what do those things mean to you, and what do those things look like for other people maybe that you've helped? Because I would consider myself someone who is like recovered, maybe not from like a full-blown eating disorder, but just definitely those like
Mhm.
disordered patterns. But I do find like I'm in a period of life now where, things are very stressful, and it kind of like those behaviors start to like creep back in a little bit. And
Absolutely.
I don't like, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, like for the listeners, mostly, not for me personally, I'm okay. But like, how do you kind of like, what does that process look like? And how do you kind of make it an everyday thing? And I guess, I don't know, I'm not being very articulate at the moment, but
No,
you
no,
get what I'm
no.
saying.
I totally get what you're saying. From my own personal work, just like through recovery and working with a lot of clients, is like knowing that it's not like a copy and paste type of thing. Being in diet culture for such a long time, I was constantly following like, do this, do this, do this, you lose weight. And like, do this, do this, do this, you'll gain muscle. Like, it was just, I had like essentially like a list of things to do. And I followed that because paid $1,000 to some random ass trainer. That's what I did. And so when it comes to recovery, it's not that. It's so different. Everybody has their own individual experience. Everybody has their own individual traumas and their own reason for immersing themselves in diet culture or having disordered eating or an eating disorder. And I think for me, it was just understanding that like this is going to be my own personal journey, and there is no specific timeline when it comes to it. And knowing that it is a lifelong journey. It's not like this, oh, I've arrived at my destination, I'm here, and the work is done.
Mhm.
And I think that that was something that probably deterred me for a long time, because it was just like, this seems like a lot of work. It seems like a lot of work to unlearn all of these like patterns and create new neural pathways and all of these things for myself. And I think though I got to the point where I was like, I'm doing a lot of work in diet culture and my eating disorder. That is a lot of work, and like let me try and do some other type of work that's more healing. And I think for me too, when it comes to like healing, I mean, we live in a culture that has really like, which I love, is really into healing and all of these things. But I think sometimes we lose ourselves in healing. I think
Mhm.
sometimes that it becomes our entire identity, and knowing that like we can take breaks, we can take a step back, we can just like enjoy life and um give ourselves grace and compassion through the healing process. I think sometimes in the beginning, of course, like it's a lot of hard work, but like giving yourself like space to just be human in it all. And I know you said you started this new job and like it brought up a lot of stress. And I called off an engagement last year, and it obviously brought up a lot of stress. And not that I started doing old behaviors or falling back on like my eating disorder like behaviors or patterns or anything like that, but it's not like that eating disorder voice or that like inner critic didn't come up and was like, hey,
Mhm.
like, you're super stressed out, so maybe we try this, or maybe we like go
Mhm.
on a diet. Like, it's just recognizing that like my brain was there for a really long time, and giving myself grace and compassion of like, hey, this is how I react in traumatic situations, or when I'm stressed out, or um when I'm going through a big transition, and just like having faith in myself and knowing that like I have really great coping skills, and to always fall back on like my toolbox of things that I've learned in recovery. But I am human, and those things are going to come up throughout my life. I'm sure that isn't going to be the hardest thing that I go through, although I hope I have a little bit of time before the next thing.
Yeah.
um, but yeah, I think for me, it was just like knowing that it's a lifelong journey and not this like destination that you arrive at. And it was just kind of like, okay, it took a little bit of pressure off of me in terms of healing, that I was like, okay, don't have to just like grind and hustle through my healing.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. And I think like you said a lot there. I'm kind of just like piecing it together in my mind. But one of the things I think was that you maybe it sounded overwhelming, like when you were thinking about pursuing healing. Is that something that you see a lot of people struggling with? Do you find also, maybe this is a two-part question. Do you find a lot of people are thinking that it's not bad enough to
Oh,
pursue recovery? Like, how do you kind of help them through that? I think that's a big theme that's come up on this show before, I think, is this idea of like, well, it's not that bad, so I'm just going to leave it be. And I
yeah.
don't know. I don't think that's a great way to go about things necessarily, but yeah, what are your
Yeah.
thoughts or yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, ambivalence in recovery or any type of healing, I think is really like normal. I see that a lot with the clients that I've worked with in the past. I hear it a lot in my DMs of like, well, I don't think it's that bad. It was something that like I really struggled with. I never quote unquote look like I had an eating disorder. Um, and I think if for me, I realized it was like, I don't have a good relationship with food. I don't have a good relationship with my body. I don't have a good relationship with movement. Like, those are reasons enough to find healing and like, it doesn't, this idea of bad enough, I think we kind of have seen in like mainstream media of like what a bad eating disorder looks like. And it's just not that. And so I think there is a lot of ambivalence within recovery and also just the knowing the load of it. Like, it is overwhelming, it is hard work, but having an eating disorder or disordered eating or being in diet culture all the time is also really hard. So I think I got to this point where I was like, let me pick a hard that is leading me towards like freedom, joy, and like fulfillment. And also, your cat is so cute.
Yeah. He's a guest on every show. I have two cats. One of them is locked out of the room. So
So
yeah.
cute.
Yeah. Yeah, so thank you for sharing that because I think that is definitely something that's holding people back. It definitely held me back for a while, and I think, it especially stops people, I think, from getting that professional help that they might need. They're like, "Oh, it's not that bad. I shouldn't be bothering somebody about this," even if it's just talking to a friend, I feel like.
Hmm.
So that's interesting. So going back to what you were talking about with the toolbox, I love that you mentioned this. I think a lot of people do. I think anyone in the coaching space who helps people, there's some type of mention of toolbox. Is that something that you help people create for themselves? And how can they start to piece together those coping mechanisms that can help in recovery?
Yeah, I do a lot of work when I was doing like my one-on-one coaching. I'm doing support groups right now, and we actually just last week were talking about like our self-care toolbox. And I mean, self-care is like such a big conversation I think that we're always having. And I think a lot of people are like, oh, it's like bubble baths and face masks and all of these things. And um the way I see like a self-care toolbox or like a toolbox of your coping skills is like, again, this is kind of with recovery, it's like so individual to you. And I
Mhm.
think that that is something that was really helpful for me having professional help and someone like a therapist and registered dietitian, is because like all the information I was seeing online, it was just like very generic in terms of like
Mhm.
self-care and coping skills. And with working with like my dietitian and therapist, I was able to like figure out these like individual coping skills for myself and like what my self-care toolbox looks like. And so what I would do with my clients is we'd sit down and we'd figure out like what are some really great ways to find grounding within myself. Some people really like breath work and some people really like meditation. I'm someone that struggles with meditation because my mind is so chatty that like breath work is more of an active meditation for me. So like that was obviously included in my self-care toolbox. And like I always make sure with my clients that we are finding things that are like a minute to 5 minutes of self-care to like also 60 to like 90 minutes of self-care. And I always liked my clients to either put things in like a shoebox, put it on like
Mhm.
popsicle sticks, or put it in your notes, and know that when we're struggling the most, that's the hardest time to show up for ourselves. And so it was
Mhm.
like having these things on hand of like, oh, I can go to my little toolbox, I can go to my notes, and I can like pick what type of self-care or like coping skill is going to work for me in that moment. And maybe it's just I'm going to take like 10 breaths, or maybe it's I'm going to go for like a mindful walk and listen to my like self-care like grounding playlist. So really just like figuring out what works for you. And that's why I think it's really helpful to like work with someone instead of just reading a lot of sometimes BS information online.
Yeah, so that's great. I like the idea. I like the concrete tip of doing some that are like 5 minutes and some that are 60 to 90 minutes, because I think for a lot of us, especially for me, like And for some context, like I have just like started a 9 to 5 job, but like about 2 months ago now. And like before I was a business owner who just like had my time to myself, and it's like a huge adjustment. And
Absolutely.
like I kind of feel like I've just been going, going, going. And I'm like, oh, well, of course I feel like shit because I've just been like, I'll press through, but you can't do that forever. So even 5 minutes is good.
Yeah, and, like, making sure that it's, like, sustainable. I think anytime I
Mhm.
bring up self-care and I'm like, "Let's create a schedule together," and people are like, "I wanna do, like, an hour every single day," and it's like, is that realistic for your
Right. Yeah.
lifestyle? Like, can we do a minute every single day and then add on and kind of see? So making sure that, like, your self-care is sustainable because we also don't wanna, like, burn out or make ourselves feel bad about not being able to, like, meet these, like, self-care goals.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel like with any type of change, right? People are so gung ho and they're like, I'm going to do a million things. And you're like, well, like what's realistic, right? So
Right. Yeah,
for
what's
sure.
sustainable here?
Yeah, exactly. Awesome. Well, thank you for that. I think that's like a really great tangible tool people can leave this episode with. So you mentioned that you were in the influencer space, and I'm so interested because I feel like people like shy away from the term influencer, other people lean into the term. The space is obviously very huge and very varied. Can you tell us more about that? Like, what does that look like? Do you like identifying as an influencer? Are there any like unexpected pieces or and yeah, I don't know, go wild.
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of go back and forth between saying like content creator and influencer. I kind of use them interchangeably. I think for a while I really hesitated to use the term influencer just because I, I think it gets a bad rap and valid because I think there again, it's very varied, right? There's so many people out there, just kind of like the coaching space. I think the coaching space gets a lot of criticism and rightfully so. I think there's a lot of scammy coaches out there, but there's also a lot of good ones. Um, and so honestly, the influencer content creation space is something that I never was like, I'm going to be a content creator. I'm going to be an influencer. I want to have a massive like platform. Like I was just like, that was never, I mean, it was never a career. Like when it was happening. And when I was out in LA, I started sharing about my recovery. I started talking about my own experience and people started to like follow along. And I was like, oh, wow, there's like a community of women that kind of resonate with my story, are feeling the same things. And for me, showing up online was actually a way for me to help hold myself like accountable in my recovery. So it was kind of like my public journal. It was like my public diary of like my recovery and I would talk about things that I was doing and people really resonated with it. So it just kind of like the whole platform kind of just like fell into my lap and then all of a sudden I was like, "Oh my god, there's like a lot of people following along. Like what the hell?" Um and it wasn't until like 2019 when I started to make it more of like a career in terms of like doing brand partnerships. And that was a hard adjustment for me because I'm someone that I really hold myself in integrity when it comes to showing up online. I want to be a really authentic and genuine person. And I didn't want my followers to think that I was being disingenuous or just doing things to get money. And so I mean, one thing I've like really made sure is like not doing brand partnerships with people that like I don't align with. Like I'm not going to do that because that's like a quick slippery slope to go down. And I think the biggest unexpected thing that came with like influencing was just the criticism. I knew that that was expected. But having a lot of eyes on you all the time can be really difficult. I think a lot of people assume that I'm an extremely extroverted person because I do show up a lot online and I am very loud and bubbly and um all of these things, but I'm actually quite introverted. I'm extroverted with my friends and showing up online is a safe space and um for me it's like it's weird sometimes going out in Denver and like people coming up to you and saying all these wonderful things about you and I'm just kind of like I don't know how to respond. Like that's kind of been like a weird adjustment for me is just having eyes on you and also knowing that having eyes on you is going to bring up a lot of criticism and that's something that I've like had to really cope with and learned to be okay with on the platform is the trolling, is the bullying, the forums about you, all of that. That's the part I don't love.
Mhm. Yeah, I can imagine. That sounds, I don't know, that sounds terrible. I have like what, 1,1400 followers, and I'm like, "Oh, that's enough." Like that's
Yeah,
good.
I'm like, I'm good to
Yeah.
not gain anymore.
Yeah, and it's funny too because I actually like I found your account because I was in a coaching thing with Erica,
Okay.
and she's like sharing a bunch of your posts and stuff. And I was like, "Oh, cool." And she had talked a lot about how like behind the scenes stuff can be like really tricky and things like that. So does that like impact the way that you show up in like talking about your recovery, or do you kind of like try to stay, like, as authentic as possible, or is it kind of, like, as you've grown, like, more filtered? Like, you kinda have to just with, like, because you had mentioned before that, like, people come into your DMs, and obviously, like, you don't want people, like, trauma dumping in your DMs, but you also, like, wanna create a safe space for them. I don't know, I
Absolutely.
hope I'm not being presumptuous,
No,
but
no,
I
no.
would
Yeah.
assume.
Um, I think for me over the years, because I've been in the content creation space for 8 years or something like that. I've been in it for a really long time. I think I've just learned boundaries. I think for a long time, I was interacting with anyone and everyone, letting people trauma dump on me, sharing like, really traumatic experiences and holding space and all of these things. And then once I got into the coaching space, really understanding like my scope of care, really
Mhm,
understanding like my code of ethics. And now I'm more so like, thank you so much for sharing that. I would advise you to like share that with a mental health professional and really just creating
mhm,
like a mental boundary for myself, but also for them because they are not my client and that is not my job to hold that space for them. But I'm happy to like guide those people to
right.
places where they can get that support. Um, and I think in terms of filtering myself, I think I've just learned to be more private. It's not
Mhm,
that I don't show up authentically. I still very much show up as myself. It's just I've learned what to share and what not to protect like my own peace of mind and to protect the privacy of like personal things within my life. And for example, last year with my engagement ending, there was a lot of chatter and people saying, you need to tell us what happened, or,
mhm,
like, why aren't you telling us what's going on? And it was just like, this is really traumatic. Like, I'm going through a lot of grief. Like, this is something that I want to hold near and dear to my heart. And there were some people that like really disagreed with that. And I just had to learn to be okay with people being upset with that and knowing that that's not my problem. And the people that want to support me and understand where I'm coming from are going to. And yeah, I think I've just learned to have really strict boundaries and just be a little bit more private over the years.
mhm. Yeah, that's sorry, I didn't mean to take this in like this direction. I just I was
No,
like, "Oh,
totally
I'm kind
fine
of
to talk about.
interested."
Yeah.
Especially when there is like, mental health or like eating disorder type questions at stake. I think people feel almost entitled in a way to like, well, you're talking about this, so I can tell you everything, or like,
Hmm.
and I've had that too, even in the nutrition space. People are like, here's my
Oh,
food
I'm
journal,
sure.
and I'm just like, okay, like, what do you want me
Yeah,
to
I'm
do
you're
with
not my
that? Like,
client.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So,
Yeah.
I'm sure with a large platform that just kind of amplifies, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I think too, over the years, like as I'm farther into my recovery, my content is less and less about recovery.
Mhm,
Just kind of
for
as
sure.
I've grown, I've moved away from like less body image and more like women empowerment and all of that type of stuff. So I think just like as I've grown, my content has also shifted. So
For sure. It's interesting once you like don't think about healing so much because you've healed, you're like, "Oh wow, I have so much mental capacity to do other things."
yeah, I don't need to talk about it all the time.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Awesome. Well, thank you. I think there was something else I was going to say. Mm, Something. Oh, I know. So something that's come up before on the show, which is kind of interesting, people who are in this space, in this coaching space, or the helping people space. I like to ask is like, are there any pieces of advice out there right now that like you're just like, no, that is not it. Like, please stop saying this. And it could be something that people aren't thinking about, or like it could be really obvious. I don't know. I keep seeing for whatever reason the 75 hard crowd like going out there, and I'm just like, why is this still a thing? But I don't know.
I can't. I can't stand the 75 hard bullshit. It like gives me the ultimate ick.
Yeah.
I just think being really weary of like the wellness and diet culture, like co-opting different things to make it seem like it's not a diet. I
Mhm.
think there was like that app there for a while. It was like Noom and it was like
Mm,
intuitive eating, but it was like definitely a diet. And I think just being really aware that the diet industry, it's preying on your insecurities and wants your money. And so they're going to do anything and everything to make it seem like it's not a diet as we start to see more content out there that is very like anti-diet and more intuitive eating, more like joyful movement, all these things. So of course brands are going to hop on that bandwagon of making
yeah.
sure like, oh, I'm kind of staying away from this like diet talk and we're going to like use words like intuitive eating and really checking and making sure like whoever you're working with, whatever program you're doing or anything like that, just really making sure you're doing your research there because things like 75-day hard, it's like, oh, it's a mental challenge. It's like, no, it's you're literally
Yeah.
asking someone to work out 2 times a day for 75 days. Like, absolutely not.
Yeah, it's wild, honestly. Like I can't I forgot that it existed until I saw a post about it today and I was like, "Oh yeah, that's still out there." Um so
Yeah, no,
yeah.
it's definitely a thing that I like do not align
No,
with.
for sure. Me neither. Cool. Well, thank you for that. I'm just curious what people are thinking. And I honestly like in the last few months, especially like coming into this year, I've really tried to stay off of social media. I took like a complete break, like deleted all the
Love that.
apps for all of April. And I was just like, not anymore. Like
Good
I'm
for
not.
you.
And like it was hard at first. And then I was like, oh wow, my brain. Like
So much
so
more space.
yeah, for real. Sorry, my Zoom is being difficult. I
You're
like
good.
downgraded my plan to like the cheaper one and now it's like, oh, you don't have as much time. But that's okay.
I know, I know.
It's all good. So the last question, which is a question I ask every single guest, what would you tell your 18-year-old self, whether it's about recovery or life in general or anything at all?
I think I always come back to like the same thing anytime someone asks me that is like I would definitely just tell my younger 18-year-old self that like you don't have to have it all figured out and all of the things that you think are the most important like money, your weight, how you look, what size pants you like all of these things like none of that shit is really that important and like the relationships that you have, the love that you have for yourself, like the support system that you cultivate, like the work that you do that is like rooted in passion is so much more important than all of these other like surface level things that you you focused on then. And yeah, your life is going to get so much easier when you start to focus on things that like fill you up with like gratitude and joy and purpose versus just these surface level things of trying to fit into the teeniest tiniest pair of jeans.
Mhm. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for sharing that. Where can
Yeah.
people connect with you and find you and yeah, get involved
Yeah.
in your community?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram at FitFatandAllThat. I'm also on TikTok and it's that good juju. And then, yeah, my website is fitfatandallthat.com and so is my email at gmail.com. It's all the same.
Perfect. Well, we'll link all of those in the show notes so people can connect with you. Thanks so much for being here with me. Is there anything else you want to leave people with?
No, but thank you so much for having me on. And I really just appreciate this conversation. I love what you're doing. I think this stuff is super important. And yeah, if you have an unhealthy relationship with food, your body, or movement, it's definitely bad enough to seek that help. So,
That's a great quote. So thank you very much for saying that.
yes.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Julia. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Until the next episode, have a great week, and we'll see you in the next one.